With minimal access to international news, the people of the North were easily swayed by party rhetoric and quickly came to regard the war as a necessary and righteous struggle against yet another imperialist aggressor.
Just get on the ground. Alright, so today's costume is that sick call ranger. So if you guys are in the US military, you might not be familiar with that term, but basically it's that dude that always seems to avoid training because they're on like a profile or light or limited duty. They always seem to go to sick call whenever there's like a big training event going on. So that's kind of what's going on right here. And that just happens to be me right now, so I guess I shouldn't really be making fun of them, but yeah, that's today's costume. But I'm going to get a little more comfortable so you guys can understand me a little better, and also so my glasses aren't fogging up, and then we'll check out the school video. Now today we're checking out a video from the Armchair Historian, and this one seems pretty cool. So this is something that I've always wondered myself. This is talking about the Vietnam War from the North Vietnamese perspective. Now I've tried doing my own research and I found like a few videos on YouTube, but it's mainly people like talking about their ancestors who fought in the war and how they sort of lived in the tunnels and how the sort of tunnels were set up and whatnot. But this is kind of cool. I feel like it's going to give a pretty good insight. It is about 20 minutes long, so I feel like that'll be enough to sort of cover that sort of emotions and reflections of the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. So it should be a good one. I will put the original video in the video description for you guys to check out if you want to go and check out the channel. Definitely feel free to support all the channels that I'm reacting to, because again, without these awesome creators, I wouldn't really have cool stuff to react to and sort of share with all of y'all. So let's check it out.
Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Mentioning the Vietnam War is one of the fastest ways to spark controversy in any military history community.
That's true.
Opinions will rage back and forth about whether or not the USA was justified in its intervention, what mistakes it made, and if America really ever had a chance of victory. But while topics such as these are very common, what is much less talked about is the perspective of the Vietnamese people during the conflict, their motivations, the agenda of their leaders, and how they endured nearly 20 years of bloody, vicious guerrilla warfare. This video
It is pretty crazy to think about how long the Vietnam War actually was. And again, before the U.S. actually went in there, you had, I think like the French were, doing operations or something in Vietnam as well. So I'm sure they had a lot of conflict going on for a pretty substantial amount of time. But again, it is kind of cool to sort of see it from this perspective. He's right in saying that there's not a lot of people that'll sort of try and see what the perspective was from the North Vietnamese. But again, it does spark a lot of controversy. I've read a lot of crazy stuff about how the Vietnam War was actually started, and it is pretty hard for a country to be successful in any conflict when the people themselves aren't really supporting it. So there's definitely a lot of controversy, around it. But of course, that doesn't minimize what you see as far as like all the badasses and all their efforts in the Vietnam War. Because again, that's pretty inspirational for me, especially me growing up and knowing a Vietnam vet. That sort of shaped me for, convincing me to join the military.
Video will seek to explain their side of the story, as well as provide context for the stubborn spirit of resistance that enabled Vietnam to hold out against the American juggernaut despite all efforts to beat them into submission.
The content on this
Supporting
channel.
our sponsors is the best way to support our channel. Today's video is brought to you by Conflict of Nations.
All right, hell yeah, get that ad money in.
30 days. To understand the attitude of the Vietnamese during the war, one must first be aware of Vietnam's history of occupation and exploitation by foreign powers. First, there was China, which spent 1,000 years trying to absorb the nation through both conquest and cultural assimilation. However, by the 19th century, China was undergoing its own negative experiences with colonialism, as powerful European empires began expanding into Asia and destroying the old status quo. With Chinese influence on the wane, it seemed as if Vietnam might have a chance to stand on its own, but a small squadron of French warships would promptly crush those hopes. Unable to resist this technologically superior foe, the Nguyen imperial dynasty, ruling Vietnam at the time, quickly capitulated. And by 1884, most of Vietnam had become part of the greater colonial union of French Indochina.
Damn, okay.
With the Nguyen
1884?
court reduced to a puppet administration, colonial governors operated with virtually no oversight from the French state and were allowed to use any and all means at their disposal to suppress any hint of native resistance.
Damn, no
Often
kidding.
this extended to the point of criminalizing the mere act of identifying oneself as Vietnamese.
Huh.
Trapped in a thoroughly miserable existence, the Vietnamese peasants were desperate for a savior, any savior. But after decades of failed revolts and horrific reprisals, the iron grip of colonialism remained as strong as ever.
Again, this is really awesome. I like getting like this historical context to everything because, again, like you can sort of talk about the Vietnam conflict and sort of how like the U.S. actually got into Vietnam, but understanding all of this prior helps us understand the mindset that they must have had for, you know, sort of fighting back, and it kind of makes sense. But it's definitely eye-opening, and you might not necessarily be empathetic, but you can be a little more sympathetic, sort of understanding, you know, the kind of mindset they must have been in before the actual Vietnam conflict.
Yet, unbeknownst to the peasantry, the seeds of a new revolution were already being sown, not in the plantations or even in the courts of the Nguyen bureaucracy, but in the coffee houses of Paris, where the few Vietnamese lucky enough to scrape together enough money to afford a Western education were debating the merits of a strange, radical new ideology known as communism.
Okay.
Unlike any political ideology at the time, communism promised freedom and equality for those laboring under the yoke of capitalistic imperialism, and so spread like wildfire from the moment it was introduced from overseas, becoming Vietnam's dominant underground political movement by
That would be kind of cool to sort of know how communism really got into Vietnam, as far as like who the key players were in actually introducing it.
the early 1930s. Central to the communist movement in Vietnam was the unassuming son of a disgraced bureaucrat called Nguyen Sinh Quong, or as he is more commonly known, Ho Chi Minh.
Oh, snap.
After leaving Vietnam sometime in the 1910s, Ho Chi Minh drifted around Europe, visiting both the United States and possibly Britain. As early as 1918, he was a dedicated anti-imperialist, joining the group of Vietnamese patriots, which petitioned the French government for independence during the Treaty of Versailles.
Wow, never knew that.
In 1920, he was one of the many communists avidly following the progress of Vladimir Lenin's October Revolution in Russia, the success of which proved beyond any doubt that the imperialist system could be overthrown through force of arms.
Okay. I didn't know this much about Ho Chi Minh.
Inspired by Lenin's success, Ho Chi Minh chaired the first meeting of what would become the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, or ICP, in 1930, with the express goal of ending colonial rule of his native country.
Okay, wow.
But for all of his early efforts, regime change.
It's pretty crazy. Like, a lot of people wouldn't agree with communism, but it's kind of like impressive to see what it can do for certain people, because he's you know, bouncing around all these places, getting an education, trying to learn as much as he can, just so he can sort of fight against that colonialism back in Vietnam. So it's kind of interesting to sort of see it from that perspective. It's pretty powerful how one ideology can sort of, you know, influence all of this.
Change in Vietnam would not originate with the Vietnamese, but would instead be instigated from the most unlikely of sources: Imperial Japan. In 1940, Japan invaded Vietnam as part of their efforts to establish the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, or in other words, a series of client states under imperial domination. In 1945, they officially annexed the country and expelled all Western influences, including the entire French colonial administration.
Dang.
Mere months later, the Japanese surrendered to the Allies, and with their collapse, Vietnam's century-old political order had come crashing down, leaving total chaos in its wake.
Ooh, okay.
It was during this last chaotic year of the occupation that Ho Chi Minh truly came into his own as leader. He had returned to Vietnam in 1941 to organize a major resistance movement against Japanese forces known as the Viet Minh, and by 1945 he was leading an army of at least 10,000 communist guerrillas.
No kidding.
His long-awaited revolution began on August 15th, before even the ink on the Japanese instrument of surrender had time to dry, with the French colonial colonial forces in Vietnam having been disarmed by the Japanese earlier that year, there was a brief window in time where the Viet Minh had free run of the entire country.
Okay. So he kind of got like hooked up just by the Allies, you know, beating the Japanese in World War II. It sort of allowed this sort of gap to open up for him to move in. I mean, he was already doing what he was trying to do as far as like fight the Japanese so he can sort of get that power, get that position. But it's kind of weird how everything sort of fell together for him to sort of get his position.
But far from screaming defiance at the hated Western imperialists, Ho Chi Minh was instead positively desperate to secure a friendship with the United States. This was due in large part to the activities of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, or OSS, which had made contact with the Viet Minh in 1945 and selected Ho Chi Minh as their primary contact within Vietnam.
Wow, okay.
Part of what enabled the close relationship between America and the Viet Minh was their lack of a traditional communist agenda. Despite Ho Chi Minh's unabashed belief in the ideology, his primary goal was always the liberation of Vietnam. As he himself stated, at first patriotism, not yet communism.
Interesting.
As a result, both Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong initially distrusted Ho Chi Minh for his unwillingness to make class warfare a priority above national freedom. This, however,
really
struck
cool.
a chord with American observers, who were naturally sympathetic to the idea of an oppressed nation throwing off the shackles of a domineering imperialist regime.
Wow. I didn't know these roots and this relationship went this deep. It's kind of cool to hear about. I mean, I don't know. I kind of wonder where it sort of turned, but yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's cool stuff.
Thus, OSS operatives celebrated alongside the peasantry when Ho Chi Minh declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam on September 2nd, 1945. In his opening speech, he began with words familiar to every American.
Is that real audio? Wow. All right.
Behind him on the podium stood OSS Major Archimedes Patty, and as the speech came to a close, a plane bearing U.S. markings flew over the assembled crowd, which greeted its appearance with thunderous applause. All across the nation, Americans were seen as heroes and liberators, and for a moment, it seemed as if this would be the start of a glorious new relationship.
It's so crazy to hear about, like, you hear about, like, other countries that the U.S. is allies with now, and even like their relationship didn't start off like this, you know, positive. Like this seems like they would have had like an awesome relationship, awesome friendship, and they would have worked together really well. So I'm really wondering where it sort of went sour.
Between East and West. Of course, we all know that this was never really an option. The French wanted their colonies back, and the newly elected President Truman had no interest in cooperating with an openly communist regime. After negotiations with the French broke down completely, the Vietnamese had no choice but to fight for their independence. And the First Indochina War began on December 16, 1946. During this time, the Nguyen dynasty attempted to reassert its control over the nation, with the 13th emperor, Bao Dai, siding with the French and resuming his place as a puppet ruler over their occupied territories.
Damn, okay.
As the war dragged
on,
the U.S. began sending aid to the French, but after their dramatic defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, they agreed to new negotiations with the Viet Minh. The ensuing treaty split the country in two halves, the DRV in the north and the state of Vietnam in the south. Bao Dai was then unceremoniously ousted by his prime minister, Ngo Dien Diem, after a referendum determined that the state of Vietnam should become a republic. However, this was hardly a triumph of democracy over imperialism, for Diem was utterly corrupt, and the referendum was blatantly rigged. Diem even went so far as to deliberately ignore the French promise that the South would be allowed to vote on whether or not to reunite with the North under the DRV.
Okay, so again, we saw how the relationship went pretty sour for the U.S. as far as them just trying to support France, because obviously they were probably closer allies, and they didn't want to seem like they were supporting communism. But then all of a sudden the French start getting their butt kicked or something, And now the U.S. is like trying to reconsider everything. And of course, when you have all that dust getting kicked up, there's going to be some room for corruption to sort of work its way in. So let's see where it sort of goes from here.
When it became obvious that the Diem had no intention of allowing reunification, DRV-backed insurgents began popping up all over the South, causing him to become even more anti-communist, and in turn causing America to offer increasing amounts of aid to his administration.
Okay.
However, Diem proved to be a fickle ally, often refusing to cooperate with his US backers, especially in regards to rural development and land management.
That's not very smart.
In 1963, tensions finally came to a head when Diem was abruptly assassinated in a military coup d'etat that was aided by the CIA.
No
This,
kidding.
combined with the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, paved the way for a full-scale U.S. invasion.
Yeah, that Gulf of Tonkin is an interesting
From
story
the
as
outset
well.
of war, Vietnamese generals knew that a conventional victory was impossible. America was simply too powerful to defeat using traditional battlefield tactics. But the huge rural population of the South was already mostly under the sway of the DRV-backed National Liberation Front, or more commonly known as the Viet Cong, or VC. The VC, in combination with the People's Army of Vietnam, waged a successful series of campaigns against the disorganized South Vietnamese until large numbers of American troops began arriving in 1965.
Okay. Now it's starting to kick off.
Following
for sure.
American involvement, the conflict began to shift into a war of attrition.
Tunnels come
Vietnamese
into play.
defense strategy revolved around their extensive network of tunnels, which many likened more to underground cities than mere military strongholds. Over 200 miles, or 321 kilometers of tunnel were dug during the war, with the largest system at Cu Che being just 20 miles or 32.
Okay, I gotta say, I really love these animations. Like, you can really, again, they had like legit underground cities. It's pretty crazy. Like, I'm talking schools, hospitals, all this crazy stuff. Even rooms where like you couldn't even stand up all the way. So they just got comfortable living like that. And it's pretty crazy. And they got really smart too. Like, even when the U.S. tried using like gas or whatnot to try and force them out, they made like gas sumps. So like, of course, the heavy gas is going to settle in a certain area, and they sort of developed the tunnels like that. It's pretty impressive to hear about. So if you guys can find a good documentary about the tunnels, I would definitely recommend it.
Kilometers outside Saigon. Their importance was summed up in the words of Colonel Chow Lam. We knew the Americans were determined to find and destroy the tunnel system. They understood, as did we, however Cu Che went, so did the war. It was our determination not to lose even 1 centimeter of the tunnels. It was a contest of wills, resulting in some very fierce fighting. We made a tremendous sacrifice to gain victory.
Interesting.
2 years after its arrival, the United States of America expanded its bombing campaigns across North Vietnam in an effort to break their will to fight. When a North Vietnamese civilian saw the first B-57 bombers open their bomb bays over his home province of Quang Minh, his first thought was not to flee in panic, but was instead, why is a mother airplane dropping baby airplanes?
Whoa, that's pretty
Miraculously
crazy.
survived the initial attack, he gathered his family and fled for the nearby caves. He later recalled to a journalist, "People didn't talk about the meaning of the war. We were really confused why the Americans tried to invade our homeland. We hadn't done anything to them." Sadly, the citizens of Vietnam had much more to fear than American bombs. When Viet Cong guerrillas went to ground among the rural peasantry, U.S. forces responded by declaring any villages with a suspected VC presence as free fire zones.
Ooh, free fire zones.
Then came the infamous My Lai massacre on March 16, 1968, when at least 347 unarmed civilians were brutally executed by American soldiers.
Yeah, not a good look.
Although the heroic actions of a U.S. helicopter crew saved a few innocent lives, most were not so fortunate. And My Lai would go on to become known as the worst war crime ever perpetrated by U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. As traumatizing as the war was for the civilian population, it was arguably just as bad for the Vietnamese soldiers on account of how long most were expected to serve on the front lines.
I didn't know the conditions
Le
were that
Cao
bad for
Dai,
them.
head of surgery at a military hospital, later recalled, "When we were called to go south, everyone was very excited. As it turned out, while I only planned to stay for 6 months, I ended up staying for 8 years."
Golly. Holy cow.
Given these extended deployment times, Vietnamese soldiers quickly became hardened to the horrors of war and had little mercy for any Americans unfortunate enough to fall into their grasp. American pilots were especially loathed due to their indiscriminate bombing campaigns, and many were tortured to death after they bailed out over Vietnamese territory.
Yeah, that's another thing. Like the POW stories from Vietnam are pretty intense. Like you hear a bunch of POW stories from like World War II and whatnot. And of course, they have their own emotion and weight. But hearing the POWs from Vietnam, mainly because of how like cruel they were treated, it's pretty crazy to hear about. They have some pretty incredible stories. So that's a whole nother thing as far as like the amount of, torture and abuse that some of those guys went through. Again, the whole situation's pretty crappy, but those POW stories are something to hear.
To keep their populace motivated and stave off the effects of war weariness, the DRV maintained strong and effective propaganda campaigns throughout the conflict. The mastermind behind these campaigns was Vo Nguyen Giap, a renowned military leader who had fought alongside Ho Chi Minh since the 1940s. People quickly formed long queues to purchase his newspapers and listen to loudspeaker broadcasts about the latest developments on the front lines.
Again, the power of that ideology.
With minimal access to international news, the people of the North were easily swayed by party rhetoric and quickly came to regard the war as a necessary and righteous struggle against yet another imperialist aggressor. By contrast, the urban population of the South could listen to foreign news reports and had a much more conflicted attitude towards the violence tearing apart their nation.
Yeah, it's kind of like North and South Korea.
The success of the Vietnamese propaganda machine was demonstrated following the Tet Offensive of 1968, which caught U.S. forces completely by surprise. Amidst the chaos, VC infiltrators launched an attack on the American embassy in Saigon, penetrating the compound and opening fire on the Chancery building with rocket-propelled grenades. Although the building withstood the assault, the fact that such an attack had occurred at all was psychologically devastating to the USA, proving that not even the capital city of South Vietnam was safe from communist infiltration. The Tet Offensive also brought the reality of war to the urban population of the South, leading many to lose confidence in the Western-backed government.
Again, the animations are kind of cool. They might be a little bit extreme sometimes or dramatic, but it is kind of cool to sort of take these things like the Tet Offensive and sort of visualize them like this, because there's not a whole lot of footage that comes out of certain events like that. But again, you can really take something and really manipulate it to sort of spread this sort of ideology. And again, they're going to take advantage of that because they don't necessarily have the technology. So if they have the support as far as like the ideology, then that can probably take them as far as they need it to go.
In the early 1970s, the endless jungle warfare had taken their toll on both sides. But the DRV remained defiant, while U.S. morale had plummeted to the point where soldiers were openly ignoring orders and deserting in record numbers. Desperate to at least preserve the status quo, America began pouring resources into strengthening the South Vietnamese army while pulling out its own traumatized troops out of the conflict. But it was too little, too late. And in 1975, a massive offensive by the DRV known as the Ho Chi Minh Campaign smashed through the defenses around Saigon and decapitated the Republic. After almost 20 years of war and millions of deaths, the DRV finally stood triumphant. Millions? Against all odds, communism had won.
Yeah, very familiar to what's going on.
While the sacrifices made by the North Vietnamese during the war allowed them to survive and eventually reunite with the South, the conflict would leave millions on both sides scarred for life. Furthermore, despite the expectations of the international community, communism failed to spread throughout Southeast Asia after the fall of Saigon, rendering decades of U.S. obsession with the domino theory utterly pointless. Despite the repeated entries of Ho Chi Minh and extensive testimonies by OSS operatives in the 1940s, America never fully grasped that it was the desire for liberty, not communism, that motivated the North Vietnamese to fight on against the odds. Their support of the corrupt Diem administration only furthered this rift in understanding, and the resultant 2 decades of violence opened up a deep national wound between North and South that has yet to be fully healed.
Wow.
Thanks again to
That was an awesome video. Again, that quote where he's saying, like, above all, patriotism, or like, you know, first patriotism and then, you know, moving to other things like communism. That's a pretty interesting thing. Again, having that sort of like insight as far as what you know, Ho Chi Minh's mentality was. It's kind of interesting to hear about. And again, like he sort of reiterated at the end, that's kind of like a lot of things that they were focusing on, is trying to get that liberation before anything else. That was their primary goal. And if you don't necessarily understand what the goal is, then you're going to misinterpret it and sort of take it to a different level. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. Again, it does sound very, very familiar. Like you see a lot of people online who are comparing, you know, Saigon with Kabul and whatnot. So yeah, people say history repeats itself, and you do kind of see that from time to time. But again, I do love these sort of videos because they do add a whole bunch of context, because you're not going to be able to sort of learn about all the pre-existing things before all these conflicts. As far as like World War I, World War II, you'll learn what caused it. But as far as like, you know, the ideology that started from certain countries as to why they joined a specific side, especially with Vietnam, you might learn a little bit about the Tet Offensive or a little bit about Ho Chi Minh, but not so much about, you know, his history and how he sort of grew up and his sort of ideology. So I love these videos. I love how they can provide that context, and I love being able to sort of share it with all of y'all. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. This is definitely a little bit of a longer reaction video, but I love checking out these sorts of videos because, again, it really allows you to educate yourself and sort of think beyond what you were just, you know, taught in school. But again, it was a pretty crappy situation in general. There's a lot of really incredible stories that come out of Vietnam. And again, I have utter respect for those who went and fought over there because it was pretty brutal. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. If you have anything to sort of add to this video or any Vietnam stories to put, you can throw them down in the comment section and we'd love to hear them. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Definitely feel free to check out the channel. They do a lot of really, really solid stuff. But thank you guys for watching. That is it for this video. I'll see you on the next one.